Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into one of the most influential and, let's face it, controversial political texts ever written.
Yeah.
The Communist Manifesto.
Oh, absolutely.
By Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels.
Mm-hmm.
Published back in 1848, this pamphlet wasn't just some dry academic theory. It was a call to action.
Right.
A vision of a future where the working class rises up and overthrows the whole capitalist system.
And it starts with a bang, doesn't it? A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. Just imagine reading that in 1848.
Whoa.
It's a declaration.
Yeah.
It's acknowledging that all the powers that be, the Pope, the Tsar politicians, are already terrified.
Like they're saying, hey, we're here, we're growing, get used to it. But what exactly were they proposing that had everyone so riled up?
Well, at its core, the manifesto argues that all of history, every clash, every revolution boils down to class struggle. One group oppressing another.
Right.
You can see it throughout history.
Yeah.
Freeman versus slave, lord versus serf,
Recent?
guild master versus journeyman.
Interesting.
Each era has its own version of this power dynamic.
So they're saying this isn't just some new idea. It's a pattern woven into the fabric of civilization.
Exactly.
But how does that apply to their time, the 19th century?
That's where things get really interesting.
Right.
They argue that in the modern world, this struggle has been distilled down to two main players. The bourgeoisie,
Okay.
the capitalists who own the factories, the land, the means of production,
Right.
and the proletariat,
Uh-huh.
the workers who sell their labor to survive.
So you have the owners versus the workers.
Exactly.
And the manifesto paints this incredible picture of the rise of the bourgeoisie.
Yeah.
They weren't always on top, right?
Right.
They started as serfs in the Middle Ages,
Mm-hmm.
clawing their way up to become this dominant force by the 19th century.
It's fascinating, the irony.
Yeah.
The bourgeoisie, the very class they critique, were once the disruptors themselves,
Yeah.
overthrowing the feudal system,
Right.
laying the groundwork for global trade.
So in a way, they're saying, we've seen this pattern before. The oppressed become the oppressors.
That's a great way to put it.
But then the manifesto takes this sharp turn, launching into this blistering critique of capitalism.
Yeah.
It's pretty intense.
They argue that capitalism is inherently exploitative.
Okay.
It's constantly chasing higher profits, driving down wages, creating this cycle of boom and bust that leaves the workers vulnerable.
So it's unstable by nature.
Exactly.
And what's that phrase they use?
Oh, yeah. They even say capitalism creates its own gravediggers, the proletariat.
Wow.
By concentrating them in factories, forcing them to recognize their shared plight and their collective power.
Okay, so capitalism is creating the very force that could overthrow it. That's a pretty bold statement.
That is.
But why is the proletariat so special? Haven't there always been oppressed groups throughout history?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
The manifesto argues that the proletariat is unique.
How so?
They're not tied to land like peasants
Right.
or to small businesses like artisans.
Okay,
Their existence depends on the wage labor system.
got it.
So they have the most to gain by smashing it.
Nothing to lose but their chains.
Exactly.
Powerful stuff.
They have the potential to unite, to
Yeah.
rise up and create a totally different society.
But it's not just a spontaneous uprising, right?
Right.
The manifesto outlines a process.
It does.
The proletariat moves from individual struggles to forming trade unions,
Right.
to eventually creating a political party that can actually seize power.
That's the goal.
So it's about developing that class consciousness,
Yeah,
recognizing their shared interests and power as a group.
exactly.
But what happens next? What are the concrete steps they propose?
Well, one of their most radical ideas is the abolition of private property.
Whoa, hold on.
And before you panic,
Yeah.
they're not talking about your personal belongings, your toothbrush, your books.
Okay, good. I was getting a little worried.
They're specifically talking about abolishing bourgeois private property,
Okay.
the factories, the land, the means of production, anything that allows one class to exploit another.
So it's not about everyone having the same amount of stuff.
Yeah,
It's about changing who controls the resources that society depends on.
precisely.
So it's a shift in control
Right.
from private ownership to collective ownership,
Yeah,
where the benefits go to society as a whole.
that's the idea.
And this brings us to their vision of a communist society, the end goal of this whole revolution.
Right.
Now we're getting to the heart of it. What does this utopia look like?
Imagine a world without class distinctions, where the means of production are owned in common, where each individual is free to develop their potential, contributing to the well-being of all.
It's a radical departure from the world they were living in.
Absolutely.
And this wasn't just some abstract theory for them.
No.
Remember, they were writing this in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, witnessing firsthand the misery, the inequality it generated.
Yeah.
They truly believed that capitalism was unsustainable and that it would eventually be overthrown by the very forces it created.
Right.
And here's the thing, even though it was written over 150 years ago, you can't help but notice some parallels with the world today.
Definitely.
Think about the growing income inequality, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, the global reach of capitalism.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, are Marx and Engels' observations still relevant in the 21st century?
That's a great question.
But before we jump ahead, let's unpack some of the criticisms that were leveled against the manifesto even back then.
Okay.
Because this text, let's be honest, was a lightning rod for controversy.
Oh, absolutely.
Right from the start, people pushed back against their ideas. So what were some of the major criticisms?
Well, one common criticism was that abolishing private property would just lead to widespread laziness.
Interesting.
The argument was, if nobody owns anything, what's the incentive to work hard?
Yeah, it does sound like a slippery slope, right? Everyone just lounging around, nobody producing anything.
Right, but the manifesto directly addresses this.
Okay.
Marx and Engels argue that under capitalism, the people who work the hardest often get the least, while those who own the most often don't work at all.
Interesting point.
So the idea that people are inherently lazy doesn't really hold up when you look at how the system actually functions.
So they're turning that argument on its head.
Exactly.
But what about the criticism that abolishing the family would destroy social order? That's a pretty big word.
Now, this one requires some context.
Okay.
They weren't advocating for abolishing all families, like in some dystopian nightmare.
Okay, good.
What they criticized was the bourgeois family, which they saw as being built on capital and private gain.
So they saw the traditional family structure as a reflection of the economic system.
Yes.
Not some eternal, unchanging truth.
Exactly.
And then you have the criticism that abolishing nations would weaken societies. That's a big one, especially in the 19th century.
It is, but it's interesting because they were writing this at a time when national identities were already being challenged by the forces of globalization.
It's true.
And they argued that national differences were fading anyway due to capitalism, and that the unity of the working class should transcend national boundaries.
So they saw the proletariat as this global force united against a common enemy. The capitalist system.
Exactly.
And that leads us to a crucial question.
Yeah.
How did they envision this revolution actually unfolding?
Well, they didn't see it as some spontaneous uprising.
Okay.
The manifesto outlines specific stages of development.
Okay.
It starts with individual struggles against particular employers.
Got it.
Then evolves to forming trade unions to gain collective bargaining power.
So it's about organizing, building solidarity, and raising awareness among the working class.
Exactly.
So they're not just waiting around for change. They're actively working to make it happen.
That's the key.
But what are some of the specific measures they propose? What does this transition to a communist society actually look like?
Well, that's where we'll pick up in our next installment.
Ooh, a cliffhanger.
We've only just scratched the surface of the ideas contained in the Communist Manifesto.
So stay tuned, deep divers. There's much more to explore as we delve further into this revolutionary text.
Absolutely.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're continuing our exploration of the Communist Manifesto. And last time we left off with those fiery criticisms of capitalism and the call for a revolution led by the proletariat. But let's be honest, some of the manifesto's ideas like abolishing private property or rethinking the traditional family can sound pretty radical.
Oh, absolutely.
Even today.
Definitely.
And it's easy to dismiss them out of hand if you don't understand the historical context that shaped those ideas.
Yeah, it's like trying to understand a movie without knowing anything about the director or the time period it was made in.
Exactly. So let's put ourselves in Marx and Engels' shoes for a minute. Imagine living in the 19th century, surrounded by the rapid changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
Cities are swelling with workers, leaving rural areas, seeking jobs in factories where conditions are often brutal.
It was a different time.
It's almost hard to fathom from our modern perspective.
Right. And remember, this was before labor laws, before social safety nets, before any concept of a minimum wage.
Wow.
Exploitation wasn't just an abstract idea, it was the daily reality for a vast majority of the working class.
So when they talk about the exploitation of workers, it's not just theoretical.
No.
They're drawing from what they're seeing firsthand.
Exactly. And they saw capitalism as more than just an economic system. It was a force that was reshaping society, transforming human relationships, and alienating people from their labor and from each other.
So their critique goes beyond just economics.
Yeah.
It's about how capitalism affects the very fabric of our lives.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that they weren't just trying to tweak the system to make a few reforms here and there. They believed that capitalism was fundamentally flawed and needed to be completely replaced.
So it's not about making capitalism nicer.
Yeah.
It's about creating a completely different kind of society.
Right.
And that's where their vision of a communist society comes in.
Exactly.
It's about creating a world where people are no longer defined by their relationship to capital, where everyone have the opportunity to reach their full potential.
A world without exploitation and alienation.
It's a vision of true equality. Of course, history shows us that putting those ideas into practice has been far from easy, to say the least.
Oh, absolutely. The history of communist experiments in the 20th century is complex and, in many cases, tragic.
Yeah.
But even if those attempts fell short of the ideal, the manifesto's concerns about inequality, exploitation, and the dehumanizing aspects of capitalism are still relevant today, wouldn't you say?
I think so. We may not be living in the same world as Marx and Engels.
True.
But many of those concerns echo in modern debates about income inequality, workers' rights, and the power of corporations.
Precisely. And that's why the manifesto continues to spark discussion and debate even today.
Yeah, it's still relevant.
It forces us to examine our own assumptions about the way the world works and to consider alternative ways of organizing society.
It's a call to question the status quo.
Exactly.
To think critically about how our economic system affects our lives.
Yeah.
And to imagine a world where things could be different.
Now, the manifesto doesn't just lay out a theory.
Okay.
It also proposes a plan of action. It outlines the steps necessary for the proletariat to seize power and create this new society.
So they weren't just armchair revolutionaries.
Yeah.
They had concrete ideas about how to bring about this change.
Right. And this is where things get really controversial because they advocate for a revolutionary overthrow of the existing order.
Wow.
They argued that the proletariat can't just wait for capitalism to collapse on its own. They have to actively work to dismantle it.
So it's not just about theorizing or protesting.
Right.
It's about organizing, mobilizing, and ultimately engaging in a struggle for power.
Exactly. And that's where the concept of class consciousness comes in. The proletariat needs to develop an awareness of its own interests, its shared exploitation, and its potential to act as a collective force.
It's about moving beyond individual grievances to a shared understanding of their situation as a class.
Right.
And the manifesto outlines how this might happen.
It does.
It starts with individual struggles against employers, then evolves into forming trade unions to fight for better conditions and wages.
It's about building solidarity, raising awareness, and learning to use their collective power to create change.
Right. And eventually this leads to the formation of a political party dedicated to overthrowing the capitalist state and building a new society.
Exactly.
It's a gradual process of building awareness, organizing, and eventually seizing political power to enact real change.
That's the plan.
But what are some of the specific measures they propose? What does this transition to a communist society actually look like?
Well, they start with abolishing private property,
Okay.
particularly land ownership, with all rents being used for public purposes.
So it's about taking the means of production out of private hands
Right.
and making them collectively owned.
Exactly.
But what about individual belongings? Would people still be able to own things like houses or personal possessions?
That's a great question, and one that the manifesto addresses directly.
Okay.
They differentiate between personal property and bourgeois property, meaning the kind of property that's used to exploit others.
I see.
Think factories, large estates, or resources that should benefit everyone.
So it's not about taking away your toothbrush or your favorite book,
Right.
but about redistributing the resources that create vast inequalities.
Exactly. They also advocate for a heavily progressive income tax,
Okay.
where those who earn more contribute more to the common good.
So it's about redistributing wealth and ensuring everyone has a basic standard of living.
Yes. What else?
What else is on their list of radical changes?
Well, they also propose abolishing inheritance,
Interesting.
arguing that it perpetuates inequality and gives an unfair advantage to those born into wealth.
So it's about creating a more level playing field where everyone has equal opportunities regardless of their background.
Exactly. Were there any other significant changes you were curious about?
Yeah, were there any other big changes they envisioned?
They also talked about centralizing credit in the hands of the state, nationalizing transportation and communication systems, expanding state-owned industries, and combining agriculture and manufacturing to blur the distinction between town and country.
Wow, it's a pretty comprehensive plan to restructure the entire economic and social fabric of society.
It is. And while these measures might seem extreme to some,
Right.
it's important to remember that Marx and Engels saw them as necessary steps
Yeah.
to transition from a capitalist to a communist society.
So they're not meant to be permanent features of a communist utopia,
Right.
but tools to dismantle the old order and create the conditions for a new kind of society to emerge.
Exactly. And ultimately, they envisioned a society where the state itself would eventually wither away,
Interesting.
replaced by a system of free association and communal self-governance.
It's a fascinating and complex vision,
It is.
one that continues to spark debate and controversy even today.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into the Communist Manifesto,
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that this document is more than just a historical artifact. It's a powerful reminder that the struggle for economic justice,
Right.
for a more equitable world,
Yeah.
is an ongoing one.
It's a challenge to confront the limitations of our own economic system,
It is.
to consider alternative ways of organizing society, and to imagine a world where human well-being takes precedence over profit.
Well said. And while the specific prescriptions of the manifesto may not be universally applicable to our current context, its underlying concerns about inequality, exploitation, and the dehumanizing effects of capitalism are still very much alive today.
It's a call to action.
Yeah.
To engage in critical thinking, to challenge the status quo, and to work towards a world where, as they put it, the free development of each is a condition for the free development of all.
And on that note, I think it's time to take a short break. When we come back, we'll explore the legacy of the manifesto and how its ideas continue to resonate in the 21st century.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've spent this episode really unpacking the Communist Manifesto,
Yeah.
exploring its historical context, its critique of capitalism, and its vision for a radical new society.
It's been quite a journey.
It has.
And as we wrap up,
Yeah.
it's worth thinking about the lasting impact of this document.
Okay.
Love it or hate it,
Mm-hmm.
there's no denying that the Communist Manifesto has left a mark on history.
It sparked revolution-shaped political movements,
Yeah.
and it's still debated and discussed even today. It's like this intellectual earthquake that sent shockwaves through the world, the aftershocks of which we're still feeling.
Exactly. And that raises a big question.
Yeah.
What's the relevance of the Communist Manifesto in the 21st century?
I mean, the world has changed so much since Marx and Engels wrote it.
Right.
We have labor laws, social welfare programs, a globalized economy. It's not the same world of factories and stark class divisions that they were writing about.
True.
So are their ideas still relevant today?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
While the specific context has shifted, I think some of the manifesto's core insights about the nature of capitalism still resonate.
Like their analysis of how capitalism can create vast inequalities,
Yeah.
concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few,
Right.
and lead to exploitation and alienation.
Exactly. And even if we don't see a full-blown proletarian revolution on the horizon,
Right.
the manifesto's critique of these aspects of capitalism still has something to teach us.
It reminds us to be critical of the systems we live under,
Yeah.
to question assumptions,
Uh-huh.
and to consider alternative ways of organizing society
Right.
that prioritize human well-being over profit.
And to recognize that the struggle for economic justice and equality is an ongoing one.
It is.
The manifesto might not offer a perfect blueprint for the future,
Right.
but it provides a framework for understanding the dynamics of power,
Okay.
class, and social change that are still at play today.
It's like a lens that helps us see the world more clearly,
I like that.
to connect the dots between seemingly disparate events
Yeah.
and recognize the underlying forces that shape our lives.
It encourages us to think critically about our own role in the system, to ask ourselves if we're perpetuating inequalities or working towards a more just and equitable society.
And perhaps most importantly,
Yeah.
it reminds us that things can be different,
Right.
that the way we organize our society and our economy isn't set in stone.
Absolutely.
We have the power to imagine and create a better world.
That's a powerful message.
It is.
Even if you don't agree with all of the manifesto's conclusions.
So to our listeners out there,
Yeah.
whether you're a seasoned scholar or just curious about this influential text, I encourage you to pick up the Communist Manifesto and give it a read.
Definitely.
See what resonates with you,
Yeah.
what challenges your thinking, and what insights it might hold for navigating the complexities of our world today.
Because as we've seen, the Communist Manifesto is more than just a historical document.
Right.
It's a living text, a conversation starter, a call to action.
Yeah.
And its ideas continue to shape our understanding of the world and inspire those who strive for a more just and equitable future.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We hope you found it as thought-provoking and engaging as we have. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.